Hi everyone, and thank you for joining today's Sprintax non-resident tax webinar for J1 visa holders. My name is Anna Fitzpatrick and I'm an account manager here at Sprintax. And the aim of today's session is to bring you through everything you might need to know about non-resident tax as we move closer to the 2023 tax filing season. Before we start, just some general housekeeping. You may notice the webinar is muted to attendees. That's to help us manage attendee numbers and background noise and things like that. But if you do have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, feel free to use the questions box and I'll get to questions towards the end of the webinar. Also, because it is tax that we're talking about, we generally always have to start off with some type of a disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give you a general understanding of non-resident tax as it applies to J1 visa holders in the US. So it's important to keep in mind that each individual has their own unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and tax compliance. But looking at what I'll aim to cover in today's session, I'll look at an overview of tax for non-residents on J1s, looking at things like residency for tax purposes, important dates, who needs to file this tax season. We'll look at some guidance around employment and receiving US income, including like federal tax withholding, FICA taxes, tax treaties. I'll look at understanding the implications of filing an incorrect tax return and what that can look like and how to rectify that. We'll go through some Sprintax solutions to assist with tax compliance and questions and discussion, as I mentioned, towards the end of the session. And if people would like to access the slides, if you go to the handouts in your control panel, you'll be able to download them from there. But looking at some important dates, so the 2023 tax filing season is looking back on the 2023 tax year, and it's looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2023. So we're looking back on that period to any income that you earned, any presence in the US, any taxes that were withheld on that income. And ultimately, we're looking to see if you might have over or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. And the tax filing deadline, which seems a while away yet, but it will be honest before we know it, is April 15th, 2024 for the 2023 tax filing season. And just to note, the tax filing season will generally kick off around the end of January. So there's nothing to do now for the 2023 season. It'll be, in the new year in early 2024. First, then looking at residency for tax purposes, and this is definitely a concept that can tend to confuse a lot of J1 visa holders in the US. The first important thing to mention is that residency for tax purposes is independent of your visa or immigration status. So for J1 interns, trainees, summer work travels, camp counselors, au pairs, teachers and researchers, you're generally automatically considered a non-resident for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years in the US preceding the current year. So if you're a non-resident, you're treated differently to that of a resident alien, and you'd be taxed differently and you wouldn't get the same deductions and credits as a resident for tax purposes. Then if you've been in the US for longer than that 2-year period, the IRS will use what's called the substantial presence test to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially this will look back on the last 3 years and it will take all of the days of presence for the current year. It will take a third of the days of presence in the year before the current year and a sixth of days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to over 183 days, then you would be deemed a resident for tax purposes. And the good news there is that if you're using Sprintax returns or Sprintax forms, we would be able to assist you with your residency for tax purposes. This is just a useful residency summary table with some of the common or popular visa types, as well as the number of years that you'd be exempt from the substantial presence test, and then also some details on FICA exemption. But looking at the big question then of who actually needs to file for 2023. So importantly, every non-resident needs to do something and has some type of IRS filing obligation. Generally for J1 visa holders who are present on US soil as a non-resident for tax purposes, the minimum filing requirement is going to be Form 8843. And this form needs to be filed if you're present on US soil as a J1, and it needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. But also, if you did earn income, it needs to be filed alongside your federal tax return. But in many cases, and particularly as that of J1 visa holders, you would be receiving taxable income during the tax year. So maybe you're getting wages, salaries, employment earnings, for example. And as there's no personal exemption amount for non-residents, if you earn anything over $0 of taxable US sourced income, you'll generally need to file a federal tax return, which would be the 1040 NOR. And then for people who were here in previous tax seasons, the 1040 NOR EZ, that form has been discontinued since the 2020 tax filing season. This is another common question that we get from some non-residents. What type of income doesn't trigger a filing requirement in the US for a non-resident for tax purposes? So we have some common examples listed there. Money transferred from parents and relatives overseas. So if you receive money from a parent or a relative to assist you with the cost of living when you're in the US, as it's coming from overseas, it's generally going to be considered foreign sourced income, and as a result shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. Income earned in your home country then, so maybe you had a job before moving to the US and you're still receiving employment earnings for your last paycheck. Again, as long as that's coming from overseas and it's considered foreign sourced income, it shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. Interest on your regular savings account, that's the third one there. And then lastly, maybe not too common for J1s, but if you had a scholarship or a fellowship, a grant or a targeted grant or an award for services or activities conducted outside the US, that's generally going to be considered foreign sourced income. And again, non-residents are only taxed and required to report their US sourced income. Next, looking at some of the income documents you may receive to report the income that you received during the tax year. So we have the W2, 1042S and 1099 series documents. The W2 is probably most common for J1s. It's going to outline things like your wages, salary, compensation that you earned during the tax year, as well as the taxes that were withheld on that income. And generally the deadline to receive your W2 for the 2023 tax year would be by January 31st, 2024. The 1042S may pop up as well. It reports things like tax-free exempt income, stipends, taxable scholarships, prizes or awards. And the deadline to receive a 1042S, if you're due to receive one, would be by March 15th, 2024. 1099 series documents, they should be less common for non-residents, but we might see them pop up if maybe the employer or the payer of the income didn't know that the individual was a non-resident. They might provide one to report things like rental income, investment income, or commissions, for example. And again, the deadline here would be by the end of March. So if you receive one or multiple income documents, you'll need to report all of them on your individual income tax return. Looking quickly at state taxes then, so up to this point when we've talked about things like residency for tax purposes, who needs to file, that has been on the federal side of things. And when it comes to the state tax side, states have their own individual state tax rules and state residency rules. Some will say you only need to file if you earn over a certain threshold. Others will say you need to file from the very first dollar. It can also depend on things like your visa type, the type of work you're being compensated for, the amount of time you spent in the state. So it can be tricky figuring out if you need to file state or not. So on the Sprint tax return system, the system will automatically figure out if you need to file state or not, and you'll have the option of using Sprint tax to prepare your state tax return. Moving on to employment and receiving income in the US during the tax year. A key consideration here would be FICA taxes or Social Security and Medicare. So, in short, FICA is essentially a tax that is paid into that will assist you with the cost of healthcare when you get to a certain age. But in the eyes of the IRS, as a non resident on a J1 visa, you generally won't be in the US long enough under this visa type to enjoy the benefits of this tax. And as a result, non residents on J1 visas should not be paying FICA. Now, it's not a blanket rule. If you had anyone on a H-1B, J2 or TN visa, they would be subject to FICA from the first day of their employment. So what we often see, particularly with that of J1 visa holders, is maybe your employer isn't aware of this consideration and they might tax you in the same way that they do their resident aliens incorrectly. And in some cases, they might withhold FICA or Social Security and Medicare incorrectly. If that happens, there are opportunities to claim it back. The first would be to reach out to your employer and request the FICA refund from them. And if they refuse, you can apply for a FICA refund with the IRS using Form 843 and 8316. Then just looking at what it can look like if you actually do have FICA withheld incorrectly. So it can result in a significant amount of tax being withheld from your pay that ultimately didn't need to be withheld. If we take the example of the J1 intern earning $40,000, if they have FICA withheld incorrectly, it can result in over $3,000 being withheld. That again just didn't need to be withheld. So although there are opportunities to claim that back, it can take a lot of time. There can be pushback from employers, and then it can take a bit of time if you're going down the IRS route. So this really highlights the importance of making sure your employer is aware of your tax position, from the point of payment and is taxing you correctly from the first paycheck to avoid having to go down the route of getting refunds back down the line. Tax treaties are another important consideration then. The US has income tax treaties with 66 foreign countries that either aim to reduce the amount of tax that's being withheld from the income that you're receiving, or might even exempt some income from tax entirely. Now, whether you're eligible or not for a tax treaty will generally be based off 5 primary factors: your visa type, your country of residence, the income type, the type of or what work you're being compensated for, and the amount of time you spent in the US. So it can be tricky figuring out if you're eligible or not. And then also, if you are eligible, you'll need to provide your employer or the payer of the income with specific tax forms or income forms to make sure that they will honor the tax treaty and tax you correctly. In addition to this, then, only some states will honour the provisions of US treaties, and forms and rules will vary from state to state. Next up, looking at misfiling. So what happens if you either forgot to file, or maybe you realise you filed as a resident and you're actually a non-resident for tax purposes? So if that happens, we always say don't panic, but do set the record straight. If you've never filed, so maybe you were here on a J1 previously, you're joining this webinar, you didn't realize you had to file back in 2021 or 2020, for example, you can catch up and backfile at any stage, and we would definitely recommend that you do so in order to make sure everything is right with the IRS. The good news there as well is that if you're due a tax refund, the IRS are happy to issue that to you if it's within the last 3 years. Then if you maybe misfiled, so maybe you filed as a resident in the past and you didn't realize that you couldn't file using TurboTax, because TurboTax will essentially only help residents for tax purposes. So if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, you can't file using TurboTax, and if you do, that would mean that you'd be misfiling. So in order to amend that, you would need to file the 1040X, the amended US individual income tax return, and you'd need to amend for all incorrect years. Another maybe common question: what happens if I don't file? What are the implications of not filing? So firstly, non-residents, as we all know, are required to comply with all US laws, including that of filing tax forms and including that of being in compliance with the IRS. It's also part of maintaining your visa status in the US. But one that I've highlighted there and that we continue to emphasize on all of our webinars is the potential impacts that it could have on your future immigration status. So maybe you're in the US on a J1 now, you might be thinking or hoping of applying for a change of status to a H1B. Maybe you're down the line looking at something like a green card. Really, tax compliance is one of the easiest things to see if someone was compliant or not. And we'd hate to see tax being anything that would prevent anyone from returning or staying in the US. So that's where the tax compliance message is the key one here, and making sure that you are filing for all years that you trigger a filing requirement. On top of that, then, if the IRS are owed money, they're definitely going to chase for it. So fines and penalties and interest can build up on that. And you might also be missing out on a tax refund. Just a quick note then to be careful about any options that are maybe being recommended to you. So firstly, as I mentioned, TurboTax, they're a great company. We work with TurboTax. We have a residency determination step on the first step on Sprint tax returns. If you are deemed a resident, we'll send you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident return with them. But TurboTax cannot help non-residents. So if you're non-resident, you won't be able to use TurboTax to file your return. Another thing we've seen over the last couple of years is that in some Facebook groups, particularly with the J1 community, there's maybe individuals posting in saying, we can file your taxes for you, we can get you the maximum refund, for example. And we would just say err with caution here and make sure you do your due diligence and you do your research. What we've often seen here is these individuals will file incorrectly, file resident returns, claim deductions and credits that the individual is not entitled to, ultimately committing tax fraud, and then keeping the money that they get for themselves. So that's just the article that we've listed there. So just to make sure you're doing your due diligence and following any instructions that you receive, maybe from a sponsor or agent, for example. Then looking at some of the supportive resources we have here at Sprint Tax to help on the non-resident tax side of things, whether it's the pre-employment side or whether it's filing your tax return. Sprint Tax Forms, firstly, is a system that would help on the pre-employment side. So it can help with determining things like your residency for tax purposes, whether you should be FICA exempt or not, whether you're treaty eligible or not, generating tax forms, so whether it's a W-4 to make sure the correct amount of federal tax is withheld, or maybe you're treaty eligible and you get an 8233, for example. And ultimately, you'll get an understanding of your tax position, you'll get your relevant tax forms, and you'll be able to print them, sign them, and provide them to your employer. That would help to make sure that you're taxed correctly on your income. Then a key system probably coming into the new year will be Sprint tax returns, and this is going to help with preparing and filing your non-resident tax returns. So many of you may receive a link or access to Sprint tax from a sponsor, agent, employer. If you do, follow those relevant instructions. If not, and you need assistance, we're of course still very happy to help you. If you follow the link, you can either log in or set up an account. And then we get into the user-based questionation. We're going to ask you residency-related questions, for example, about your current visit, previous visits, visa types, entry and exit dates. If you've been here long enough to be a resident for tax purposes, we'll stop you at that point. We'll let you know, and we'll point you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident return. And if you're not too sure on your residency, if you think you might be here long enough to be a resident, you can use this step free of charge, without needing to enter any code or make any payment. So I'd recommend going to this step, plugging in all your residency details from your first date of entry, and if you are a resident, we'll let you know. So once you've done the residency and we figure it out, okay, you are a non-resident, you can continue to use Sprint Tax. If you say yes, that you have received income, we'll ask you what income documents you have, as well as the quantity of each, and you'll be able to upload them or manually enter them into your Sprint Tax account. Then if we do have any au pairs on today's session, this will look slightly different to you, because in a lot of cases, the au pair host families don't withhold any tax from the au pair wages. So in this section, we'll generally ask you for the amount you earned from the host family and which state you were in if you haven't received any income document. Then we do have lots of support on the system. So as you can see from that pop-up there, we have live chats and FAQs. So if you have any questions going through the questionnaire, you can feel free to reach out to our support there. So as well as helping on the federal side, we can also help on the state tax side. If the system thinks that you might need to file a state tax return, we'll start to ask some questions surrounding the state tax law in that state. And then if you do need to file state, we will give you the option of using Sprintax to prepare your state tax return. Then you'll get to the order breakdown, where we'll give you a summary of the services that have been provided, whether it's a federal, state, maybe you have a FICA return. If you have any codes from your institution that might give you a discount or cover some cost, you can feel free to validate it here. And then once we get through the next stage, we'll generate your tax forms. So Sprintax Returns does offer e-filing on the federal side of things. So if you're eligible to e-file your federal return, we'll give you that option and you'll proceed with the e-file authentication and you'll e-file your return directly to the IRS. Now, the IRS does have certain limitations, which we go through in our blog listed there, where if you meet some of those limitations, you won't be eligible to e-file. So Sprintax won't give you the option then. So if you're not eligible to e-file, don't panic. We will give you a completed tax pack with your completed tax forms, as well as instructions outlining to print, where to sign it, and where to mail it. And then on the state tax return side, that will still need to be mailed, as well as if you just had the 8843 on its own with no federal return, that will still need to be mailed. But again, you'll get your completed tax pack with instructions on next steps and where to sign and where to mail the forms to. Lastly, just looking at some other support we have for tax filing and non-resident tax in general. We've lots of educational videos on YouTube, so feel free to check out our YouTube channel. We've lots of blogs and content for tax awareness. So whether you're looking for something specifically for a J1 visa category, or if you're looking for, content on a topic in general, you can check out our blog. There's tons there, and we'll have lots more coming into that next tax season. Feel free to avail of our live chat. We've live chat both on Sprintax forums and on Sprintax returns. And then we've tax workshops and webinars just like this one. So going into next tax season from January right through to the April deadline, we'll be hosting sessions just like this. So keep an eye out for details on these. If you haven't received them, they'll likely be coming from maybe a sponsor, agent, employer, institution, for example. But with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's session. I really hope you found it helpful, and I appreciate everyone joining. I know tax season probably feels like it's a while away yet, but it's good to get thinking and learning a little bit about taxes and who needs to file as before we get into January and the tax filing season. I'm just going to check and look for some questions that came through. Okay, I'm a little bit confused about the FICA taxes. I should have gotten money back. I filed FICA taxes, but still haven't gotten any refund or letter back. I didn't know I can ask my employer for a refund. What do you suggest I do now? Okay, so in that case, did you actually apply for the FICA refund? Did you send the 843 and 8316 off to the IRS? If so, like if you could send the timelines that you maybe did that. We do have a blog on the Sprintax blog that goes through, FICA FICA specifically, and at the very end of that blog, there's details on the number to call to reach out to the IRS on the FICA refund, because they don't have any kind of online portal that you can check for updates on your FICA. So I can see there that you said you applied in April and again in June. So if you've applied with the IRS, I'd hold off on applying with or going to your employer yet, because they may be in the process of processing that FICA return, and that could lead to further delays. So I try to reach out to the IRS directly by phoning them, and you can get that number on their website. If you Google like IRS FICA refund status check or something like that, it should pop up there. Can we have access to this recording? Yes, absolutely. I'll send, or you'll get an email from GoToWebinar sometime tomorrow with the copy of the recording. Some questions around like classifying expenses or qualifying expenses. So for non-residents, unfortunately, there's kind of very few expenses that you can deduct on your return. Some that you can would be if you had like qualified student loan interest, or if you had charitable contributions, for example. But in general, there's very little deductions if you're a non-resident for tax purposes that you can claim on your return. Other things that would be non-taxable might be, tuition. If you had a scholarship that just covered your tuition, that's generally non-taxable. If tax was withheld, you could potentially deduct that as well. But unfortunately, there's kind of limited expenses that can be deducted for non-residents. Okay, that looks like okay, one more question. If I forgot my Sprintex account, I need to make a new one, or what can I do? If you just forgot your password, you can, just use the forgotten password option. That's probably the best option, because if you have previous year returns, you want to be able to access them. Also, if you use Sprintex in the past, you can transfer that information from from each tax year to each tax year. So that would be the best option. And if you're still having deep issues accessing your account, you could reach out to hello@sprintax.com, and we'd be able to help you there. I'll type that and send it to you directly, um, so you can reach out if you're still having issues. But it looks like we've covered all the questions. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's session. I really hope you have found it helpful. And I wish everyone a very happy holiday season, and hope to see some of you on our tax webinars in the new year. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.